I've actually waited so long to do this, you have no idea. The amount of comments I got on my original Was It Any Good Those videos being like, haha, when's Death Knight though mate? And I've decided today is the day. I figured it would fit well alongside my current look back into Wrath of the Lich King as a whole. Imagine if we end up going to Northrend eventually too for real. Anyway, we're going to go full throwback. Enjoy the slightly modded intro. Hi, my name's Willie. I'm going to be looking back at the new class of Wrath of the Lich King and answering a very simple question. Was it any good though? Let's look at the Death Knight. Here are the points I'm going to be looking at. Their leveling experience, how good they were at it and how fast they could level. The class quests, what they were and how well they fit. PvE, dungeon and raid performance, open world battlegrounds and arenas, and tier sets, the effects they had, as well as the looks. The first new class to be introduced to World of Warcraft on the second expansion in. It had been a long time coming. When Blizzard announced during the expansion features that we're going to be getting the Death Knights, the crowd went wild. Death Knights for the longest time had been part of Warcraft dating back to the RTS games, and had always been a central part of the story surrounding the Frozen Throne and Northrend. Arthas's fateful journey, purging Stratholme, leading his men to the frozen north and destroying their ships, and even defeating Illidan's Stormrange. The chance for players to get their hands on this legacy had players drooling. Even in World of Warcraft previously, we had had run-ins with Death Knights, and they were always big characters. Baron Rivendare and the Four Horsemen in vanilla, the first Death Knight ever created by the former Lich King Ner'zhul, being Terran Gorefiend in the Black Temple, had also fallen. Aside from the lore though, this class is just cool. Like paladins, they'd always been such grand figures, towering over others on their undead steeds, plate armor, raising the dead, and bringing abilities previously seen from the RTS games into WoW itself. Enough intro though, this class has so much to be said about it. Let's just see how good the Death Knight was in Wrath of the Lich King. Starting off as we always do, at the start with leveling. Now, Death Knights were special boys in Wrath of the Lich King, the hero class. What does hero class mean, you ask? No idea, but they get loads of good stuff for free, so hey, that's pretty cool. In order to create a Death Knight, you needed to have a character at least level 55. Then Death Knights would become available to make yourself. Why? Well, because Death Knights started at level 55. Starting at level 55 gave them a great many advantages over other classes. Instead of the first dozen or so levels being you pressing one button, Death Knights got loads of cool toys thrown at them straight away. It was actually quite a lot to get your head around, but honestly you couldn't really go too wrong for reasons we'll be checking out later in the video. Not only this, but they also started with a full set of green gear in most slots, making them instantly competitive at dealing with the first enemies that were thrown at them. On top of this, their starting area gave loads of rare tier rewards, and by the time you were done with your initial quests and you were out into the open world, you would considerably outgear a fresh 60 and would crush your way through Burning Crusade content and PvP early on, simply because you were at a disproportionately high power level, because you just got so much stuff for free. And this is one of many factors that made Death Knight such a blast to play from the get-go. And after the intro quest, you were level 58 and could go straight into TBC content in Outland. As for the remainder of the questing journey, you have to take into account that by this point in the game, questing itself had changed quite considerably. As for other classes in this series before Classic came out, questing was far more of a threat back then, and well, we're in full swing of Classic at the moment, and I'm sure you can all tell me the dangers that come with taking on 3 or so mobs the same level as you. Come Wrath, it could still be a threat if you're undergeared, but Death Knights weren't undergeared, they were pretty overgeared actually. It's at this point that it's worth talking about the class design philosophy behind Death Knights. Blizzard wanted a class that would be able to DPS or tank using all 3 of their specializations. This was an unprecedented attempt to shape a class in this way. Now, as you may know, by Wrath of the Lich King, DPS classes have offensive cooldowns to improve their damage, and tanking classes have defensive talents and abilities to reduce damage taken. So if we want all 3 specializations to be able to perform in both roles, Death Knights are going to need some very strong baseline tools to support this, and they did. 2 strong in fact on release. Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell and Death Strike were the main 3, but each talent tree contained very strong improvements to defensive options, not purely just DPS talents in DPS trees or vice versa. For example, Blood had both Hysteria and Vampiric Blood, Frost had Hunger and Cold and Unbreakable Armor, and Unholy had Bone Shield and Scourge Strike. Simply put, the Death Knight toolkit was bigger and more well-rounded than pretty much any other class for the time, simply so they could compete well in both roles. And back in the day closer to the launch of Wrath of the Lich King, I remember DPSing as Blood and tanking as Frost. As long as you played reasonably well, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. Death Knights on Wrath of the Lich King launch may have been the class with the most viable specializations to ever have existed in WoW, and it was so much fun to play, from at least the point of view of the person playing the Death Knight, and you can bet you were super happy with this new class. The sheer power level and options available to you made you a king in any form of content. Tanking, amazing. DPS, fantastic. PvP, unstoppable. So this is why I say you couldn't really go wrong with Death Knight leveling. And even later on in the expansion where the Death Knight frankly just got a bit more balanced, it was still great at blasting through levels. And we'll talk more about how the class got separated out into its different specializations, which brings us to the class quests. Once again, by the Wrath of the Lich King era, these things were largely a thing of the past. I always liked these and wish they were more of a common occurrence. However, Death Knights had their own set of quests that I suppose you could call class quests as their introduction to the game. These took part in Icarus, the Ebb and Hold, floating above the Eastern Plaguelands. This necropolis served as the starting zone for Death Knights and told you their story, how you fought against humans and crusaders of the land, firing cannons, submitting a death charger to your will from the Shadow Realm, burning, pillaging, destroying, controlling a colossal frost drake to freeze your enemies. It was really something else, and it was the first time a class had got this starting zone treatment all to itself. They started at level 55 after all, so you could hardly just pop one in the Elwyn Forest and call it a day. It would have been kind of strange seeing a soldier of the Lich King killing kobolds next to a level 2 human priest, wouldn't it? And it all ended with your grand assault upon Light's Hope Chapel, alongside legions of undead and other Death Knights. And we come to see how the assault fails, Arthas, our former commander, making an appearance himself and being stopped in his tracks by Tyrion Fordring. The battle ends up being lost, but you are redeemed and freed from the Lich King's grasp, as Tyrion calls for the formation of the Argent Crusade, a new fighting force to combat the armies of the Lich King. Following this, there is the ever-memorable first time making your way through the capital city, be it Stormwind or Orgrimmar, forced to go in foot in shame, booed through the streets as you go, and then finally granted your place in your faction anew by Thrall or Varian. A very memorable moment for sure. After that, well, it's onwards to Outland, unless you went and quested in vanilla content for some reason, which I guess you could in theory. I don't remember really it being a thing though. Perhaps that would be the play these days, as Outland would be so packed. It's interesting to think about. Let's talk PvE. Now, it's important that we talk about the fact that Death Knights were rebalanced, shall we say, into their niches throughout the expansion. Released Death Knights were insane for the reasons we went over earlier. Eventually, Blood became a tanking spec, Frost more single target with burst AoE, and Unholy consistent AoE with good single target. Honestly, due to Death Knight's toolkit, you could still do each role as each specialization, but realistically, you aren't going to compete with an equally geared and skilled player unless the stars align with procs. It's important to know that, and for this we're going to be looking at popular builds and what Death Knights bring to a raid or group for their particular role. Before we get into the actual specializations though, we need to talk a bit more about certain mechanics that Death Knights have. They didn't just have one resource, they had two. First of all, runic power. This was gained by using abilities that required runes, and that was spent on other abilities that needed runic power, like Death Coil. As for runes, you had 6 of them, 2 Blood, 2 Frost, and 2 Unholy. Various abilities needed 1 or 2 runes. For example, many of your most powerful attacks like Death Strike needed 1 Unholy and 1 Frost rune. There were also Death runes. These counted as any type of rune and were generated through a number of means, mainly talents like Death Rune Mastery. On top of this, the Death Knights got enchants for free through Rune Forging, Stone Skin Gargoyle for tanking, Razor Ice usually on the offhand if you're Frost, and Fallen Crusader on the main hand or two-hand as Unholy. There were many more runes than this though, take a look through these. Remember any of them at all? We also had presences. These were kind of like stances, but didn't require certain presences to use certain abilities the way warriors do. These were more of an added benefit to the way you were playing. Blood presence increasing damage by 15% and healing you for 4% of damage dealt. Unholy increased attack and movement speed by 15%, as well as reducing the GCD of abilities by 0.5 seconds, and Frost increased stamina by 8%, reduced physical damage taken by 8%, increased armor contribution from items by 60%, and increased threat generated. Next, as for buffs for the raid, the Death Knight was also very much wanted. First of all, Horn of Winter, their standard buff for the raid, a nice extra 155 agility and strength. Remember the debuff cap as well as group-wide buffs were both totally removed in Wrath of the Lich King, so an optimal composition just got a whole lot more accessible. Going into Frost gained your raid improved Icy Talons, giving everyone an extra 20% melee haste. Very nice. Deep in Unholy, you could unlock the Ebb and Plague ability, increasing magic damage on the target by 13%. Once again, a pretty huge buff. Blood gave Abomination's Might, giving 10% extra attack power. Also in Wrath of the Lich King, many different classes and specializations could essentially use the same certain debuffs. This was to make a 10-man raid comp more flexible, so though a Death Knight wasn't especially required, if no one else could provide these buffs, it was very welcomed. So just for comparison, Strength of Earth Totem could also do the Strength and Agility buff, and Bounce Druid or Warlocks could do the 13% spell damage. With that said, let's talk Unholy. The primary focus of this specialization is sustained AoE, arguably one of the top specializations in the game for this purpose. That's not to say they can't compete on single target either, however, but the AoE is the real prize here, and you have many talents to boost up your diseases a good amount, like Epidemic, Impurity, Wandering Plague, Ebon Plaguebringer, Rage of Rivendell, and Black Ice. Also at the push of one button, Pestilence, all these mega boosted up dots are spread to every single target nearby. Add a Deafen Decay and Blood Boil on top and you are blasting on the damage meters. You know what the best thing about this is though? Pestilence instantly spreads the Ebon Plaguebringer debuff to all other targets. That's 13% extra magic damage taken. The only other methods of doing this are from Moonkins or Locks, which both require single target spells. This makes an Unholy Death Knight a very important addition to fights with frequent adds or high volumes of adds. Unholy uses glyphs such as Icy Touch of the Ghoul and Horn of Winter. As for presence usage, single target for blood, swapping targets or fights with adds spread out, you can give Unholy some consideration for the extra move speed. Frost should only be considered when other defensive cooldowns are down for the extra stamina and damage reduction. However, Unholy should also have bone armor up pretty much all the time, giving them an extra passive 20% damage reduction. This specialization is a real all-rounder that brings great raid utility, personal survivability, and solid damage in all circumstances, and it can be the go-to for leveling for the same reasons. Next up, Frost, the second damage dealing specialization. Even though it was kind of designed to be the main tanking spec from the offset, things just worked out differently sometimes than intended. Sort of how Enhancement Shamans potentially could have been a tank spec in vanilla, but I digress. Frost is the big single target specialization for Death Knights with potential to lay down some numbers on multiple target fights as well. This specialization is based around hard-hitting dual-wielding attacks that can have a bit of variation on specialization. Talents like Annihilation, Rhyme, Merciless Combat, Threat of Thessarian, and Guile of Gorefiend all add up big time. The single target on this specialization gains quite a large portion of its damage from physical attacks, like auto attacks with Blood Cake Blade, as well as Obliterate and Nerves of Cold Steel, whilst Burst AoE coming from Howling Blast aligning up with Rhyme and Killing Machine procs to completely delete huge packs of enemies. And whilst the AoE is less consistent than Unholy, the single target pulls ahead with a talent tree, as well as always bringing improved Icy talents for that sweet plus 20% melee haste. Frost uses glyphs like Obliterate, Frost Strike, and Disease. Presence usage is much the same as Unholy overall. Finally, Blood, what ended up being the tanking specialization. This was the first tanking spec to go around with a two-hander instead of them lesser classes that needed something called a shield, and honestly, it really boosted up the number of tanks you saw in Wrath of the Lich King, which was a very welcome thing by this point to the game. Also, just to note, there is a huge amount of flexibility when it comes to DK Blood talents, gear, your ability, and what buffs your group needs. The way that DK's tanked was very unique compared to others. Most other tanks focus on taking less damage and relying on healers to keep them alive. Death Knights mainly focused on just healing themselves, and they were really good at healing themselves. Talents like Rune and improved Rune Tap, Vampiric Blood, Will of the Necropolis, and improved Death Strike made them extremely sturdy and very much in control of their damage intake more so than other tanks. On top of this, they had Hysteria, which is essentially a melee version of Power Infusion, but lasting about twice as long. Very nice on your most geared melee class. Blood Death Knight tanks would of course want Frost presence, perhaps popping on Unholy to get between mobs. They use talents like Rune Tap, Vampiric Blood, and Disease, and it's kind of funny how most of the specializations for Death Knights don't use the same presence as they're linked to really. Now for PvP. So, as mentioned earlier, released Death Knights were over the top, mega overtuned, pretty much rolled everything. There's not really much to look into here. We're going to be looking at Death Knights in PvP from later on in the expansion, where they had been toned down a bit in power level. PvP was where Death Knights were able to take full advantage of their wide toolkit of talents that crossed over CC and damage to full effect. Once again, each specialization was just fine in PvP, Blood having a great cooldown based kit with strong bursts from Hysteria and Dancing Rune Weapon, and defensive options options from Rune Tap and Vampiric Blood. Frost was quite similar, but RNG reliant with Rime and Killing Machine procs lining up. It did however bring Hunger and Cold and AoE Hards DC every 1 minute that could be made free with a glyph, which made timing based comps with this spec very dangerous. Most of the time though, you ran into Unholy Death Knights. The reason being is sort of like in PvE, this specialization was just all around good. Split pressure with high damaging diseases, plants like Desecration making pillar hugging a non-option, a permanent pet with Master of Ghouls, and don't forget this pet had a stun, Gnaw as well, a toolkit of very strong defensive options through Icebound Fortitude, Anti-Magic Shell and Zone, Bone Armor, Lichborn and Death Strike made them really sturdy. The specialization was just unrelenting. It also had Unholy Blight, making dispelling impossible for its duration. On top of this, Death Knights had Death Grip, Strangulate and Chains of Ice baseline, and this constant pressure gave us comps like TSG, which was Warrior, Death Knight Paladin. 2 DPS with no resource, Mortal Strike and just the sheer pressure made it a real stomp comp at low brackets and still competitive high up. DKs were top performers in PvP throughout the whole expansion. Finally we come to the tier sets, and similar to TBC, tier sets have been separated out to fit each specialization. Gone were the days of Blizzard deciding your class is getting a healing tier set and that's it. And for Death Knights they had 2 sets, one for tanking and one for their DPS specializations. Also there were 10 and the 25 man tier sets. The 25 sets had a recolor as well as better stats. The tier set bonuses were the same. Each set for different specializations also looked the same. Finally, each tier was comprised of 5 pieces but only had 2 and 4 tier set bonuses, so let's have a look what we got. Tier 7 coming from Naxxramas and the Hands from Obsidian Sanctum was the Valorous Scourge bonus set. The 2 set for tanks giving more crit on Plague Strike and some extra duration on Icebound Fortitude. Decent bonuses for both offense and defense. As for the DPS set, more crit chance on your big spender abilities for Unholy and Frost, and some extra resources. A very nice 2 and 4 set. Also this set looks amazing. I still use it on my Death Knight today. Absolute biss looks wise for me. Tier 8, the Conqueror's Dark Rune set coming from Ulduar. The tanking pretty similar to how the previous tier was. More offense on the 2 set, more defense on the 4 set. The DPS set was quite similar. The 4 set was a nice extra contributor to the damage multiplier on those respective abilities as well. Looks wise again, this set is really great. Solid set of shoulders on this set as well for them orc boys. Tier 9 came from Trial of the Crusader and was the Triumphant Thessarian set. Try saying that 3 times. By this point we can see how the Death Knight has evolved. No longer is it just set bonuses that could benefit any potential tanking spec, but more tailored for blood, with increases to damage for Heart Strike as well as the universal Blood Strike. The 4 set giving a shorter cooldown on Vamp Blood, which was already only 1 minute baseline. The DPS set once again pretty simple, small strength proc and some extra damage on a dot. Looks wise, I don't know what it is, I've never been too big of a fan of this set, can't really say why. Finally, tier 10 from Icecrown Citadel, the Sanctified Scourgelord set. The tanking set being very strong, extra death and decay damage for better AoE threat, and the 4 set making your Blood Tap into a strong defensive cooldown. Blood Tap already only having a 1 minute cooldown baseline, and is something that already could be further upgraded through a number of means. The DPS set following suit, more damage on main abilities, even on Heart Strike still. Blood DPS was still a possibility. The 4 set being a bit more interesting, rewarding playing around your rune usage correctly for a nice damage buff. Looks wise, it's a return to form for me, very Lich King-y, if that makes sense. Overall, the Death Knight was an absolute monster, extremely popular upon release, and found its space eventually in Azeroth as a versatile DPS and a tank that would, in expansions to come, set an example of how tanking can be more than reacting, but preparing for damage to come in. So, the Death Knight, was it any good though? Well, the question almost feels rhetorical at this point, doesn't it? Yeah, they were great, a blast to play, a very welcome addition as a new tank, and despite the overtuned launch, they became a bit more in line by the end of the expansion and remain a very popular class to this day. I know I played one on release for a good while and remember those times well. Anyways, do we have any Death Knight enthusiasts in here at all? It was interesting to look back to just how they used to be. Just maybe if you guys are interested, I could look into monks too, and maybe even demon hunters. It's entirely down to you guys, you'll have to let me know. As always, I do hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one. If you like what you see, give the video a like and subscribe as there's plenty more to come. As always, thank you all so much for watching. Take care. Bye.